Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles were created and approved by the Continental Congress in 1777. So that's very early in during the American Revolution. And so much of the American Revolution, they basically operated under these rules, even though it's not ratified by all 13 states until 1781. It's basically, the Continental Congress was basically following much of this outline prior to final approval by the states. This does create a Confederation Congress. There's no executive branch, there's no president, and there's no national judiciary. The states have judges for state laws, but there's no federal judges or national judges. And a few other things about the Articles. Each state had one vote, and this really highlights the fact that that they saw each state as being primary. The state is the most important part of this group. These are groups of states that are agreeing basically to work together on certain things, but the state is still the most sovereign and the most important, which is different than what we have today under the Constitution. Under our Constitution, the United States Constitution is the law of the land, and it is the supreme law, and state constitution has to be subordinate to it. Under the Articles of Confederation, the state is seen as the most important piece of this whole puzzle, and states aren't really willing to give up their sovereignty or their power over to a federal government. And so that's kind of the idea here is, regardless of the size of a state, each state gets one vote because the state is the most important government here. Congress, some things they could do: they could declare war, they could appoint military officers, coin money, they were responsible for foreign affairs, and pass laws, but only with approval of 9 states, which means it had to be a 2/3 majority, and as more states are added, that would continue to change. The number from 9, it would stay 2/3, but the number would change based on the number of states that exist. So some weaknesses that the Articles of Confederation had, one is they could not regulate trade. They couldn't regulate trade between the states or foreign countries in the states, which is a big problem because this makes it difficult to raise any money. Because one of the main ways that governments often made money was by taxing imports and things of that nature. Well, without this ability to regulate trade, that includes the ability to tax, that creates a problem. And not only that, it couldn't regulate trade between states. So one state could start to put a tax on goods coming in from other states. In other words, there wouldn't even be free trade necessarily from state to state. And so it's really a big weakness because commerce, trade, is one of the key ways you bind a nation together. And if there's no way to say that there's free trade between the states, then you can start to have a lot of disagreement and problems between the states over these different trade issues. Another big weakness is it left it up to the states to enforce laws. There was no executive branch, and the executive branch job is traditionally to enforce laws, and without that, there's nobody to enforce it. So Congress can pass a law, but there's nobody to make it happen. In theory, the states would want to, because it was their representatives that passed the law, so the states would then go along with it. But of course, the people that chose to pass the law in the Continental Congress aren't the same people that run the state. And so there could be disagreement, and therefore states would not necessarily actually enforce laws. They also couldn't, because there was no judicial branch, there's no federal judicial branch, there's no way to settle conflicts between states. If there's a dispute between Virginia and Maryland over the border, or Maryland and Pennsylvania over the border, who's going to solve that dispute? A Pennsylvania judge or a Maryland judge? Well, you've got a conflict of interest there, and so this creates a problem. And then, as we've spoken about before, without the ability to tax, the Congress is very weak. They can simply ask or request for money. That's called a requisition. And they would make that request based on the size of the population. So if your state had 20% of the population, they would be expected to pay 20% of the tax that they're asking. And then it would be left up to the state to decide how to collect that tax, how to make that money. And that's a good idea, letting the state decide that. The problem is it leaves it up to the state whether they even want to pay the tax. Because the Congress has no power to tax, they can only request money. Guess what? The Congress very frequently does not have enough money. And this is a big problem during the war, and it remains a problem after the war. And this is one of the reasons why George Washington, who always needed more funds and more equipment, is going to be in favor of changing the Articles of Confederation to a more powerful government that we now know as our Constitution. But we're not to that point just yet. And then some other problems. And some of these problems are actually resolved. So there's a lot of land that has been claimed, especially by Virginia and Pennsylvania and some of these New York and some of these other states. And how are they going to, they're all claiming these lands, and how are they going to solve those problems without a federal judiciary? Well, eventually the states do resolve the problem. The states agreed to give their land claims to the national government, all their western land claims to the national government, and therefore that opened up to adding future states. Another big problem is money. Congress created money called the Continentals, but these Continentals were not the Congress because they couldn't tax and because they were weak. People stopped trusting that the Continentals were going to keep their value. And as people lost faith in the Continentals, the value drops, and then states start to create their own currency, which leads to a lot of confusion, as you can imagine. If you could think of every state having their own currency, and then also you have a national currency of Continentals, who's going to accept what, how are you going to pay for things, becomes very difficult. And then finally, after the war is over, Britain refused to withdraw troops from the Ohio River Valley. So, in theory, the United States has won the war, and now the British soldiers should be leaving and going back home. Well, in most cases they do, except in the Ohio River Valley area. They keep their forts there, and soldiers are still there, and the United States, is not too pleased about this. And Spain also then is not showing much respect to the United States by closing New Orleans off from American shipping, and this is going to be a big problem for Western farmers. You see, Western farmers, they can't send their goods back east easily. Because they're west of the Appalachian Mountains, and mountains are difficult to travel through, and so therefore the easiest way for farmers in the Ohio River Valley to send goods back east is actually to put them on the Ohio River, float down the Mississippi River. They would then dock in New Orleans, load up ocean-going vessels, and send them out into the Gulf of Mexico, up the Atlantic coast, and trade with the rest of the United States or anywhere else in the world. Well, if they do not have access to New Orleans, that shuts down Western farmers' ability to sell their produce around the world or even in the eastern United States. And so Spain is showing that the United States is weak. We don't have to do this. And so this causes a big problem for the United States and these Western farmers. Okay, so if you'll remember, one of the problems that they had was, what are they going to do that some of the states didn't want to give up their western land claims? Well, once those states did give up that western land claim and gave those land claims up to the federal government, the question became, what's the process that we're going to go through to settle that territory and then bring that territory in as a new state? And this is one of the things that the Articles of Confederation does well. So they create the land ordinance, and then the Northwest Ordinance. And so the Land Ordinance sets up the process of settling it and how to sell it off. And they divide it up. They divide up these territories, these townships, into 36 territories or sections, and each section is 640 acres, and you could subdivide that even more and sell that off into smaller pieces. And then once enough people settle there in that territory, based on the rules of the Northwest Ordinance, they could then apply for statehood and be admitted as a new state. And one of the things that the Northwest Territory does, the Northwest Ordinance does, in the Northwest Territory is outlaw slavery and ban slavery. And these ordinances are actually written by Thomas Jefferson, which is surprising to some people because he himself owned slaves, but then writes this law banning slavery in that new territory. And so that is one of the things that the Articles of Confederation did well.